The Philosopher Who Solved the Meaning of Life, Leo Tolstoy, updated version. The Fall, Tolstoy's existential emptiness. What if everything you've ever dreamed of, fame, wealth, admiration, turned out to be meaningless? Imagine reaching the peak of human success, only to discover that the view from the top is hollow. This was the torment of Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers who ever lived. The man who wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina, stories so grand they defined an entire century, was quietly collapsing inside. In his diaries, Tolstoy confessed that each applause, each printed edition of his novels, made him feel more disconnected from himself. He had wealth, status, family, and the respect of the world, but every night he lay awake asking a single question: if everything ends in death, what is the point of any of it? That question became his curse. He tried to silence it with work, with teaching, with philosophy, but the silence never lasted. The emptiness kept growing. By his 40s, Tolstoy was living what psychologists today would call a spiritual collapse, a crisis of meaning. The man who had conquered the literary world found himself terrified by a simple truth: nothing he achieved would last. His legacy, his fortune, his name, all destined to vanish like dust. He wrote, "When I looked at life from the standpoint of death, everything crumbled. My existence lost its meaning." And yet that awareness didn't free him. It consumed him. He stopped writing for months, unable to see purpose in words. He hid ropes and weapons to protect himself from suicidal impulses, but something stopped him. A quiet, irrational resistance, the instinct to keep looking, even when there was no reason to. And here lies the paradox. The same mind that gave the world its most beautiful novels was now battling the darkest corners of human thought. Tolstoy had become a prisoner of reason, an intellect too powerful for its own peace. Still, within that despair, a new question began to form: not what is the meaning of life, but who seems to live as if they already know it. That shift would change everything. Tolstoy began to observe the people around him, not the aristocrats or the artists, but the peasants who worked his land. They had no wealth, no education, no fame, yet somehow they smiled, they prayed, they sang, they carried their pain with grace. What did they know that he didn't? How could they find peace in a world that seemed absurd? That curiosity became the seed of Tolstoy's transformation. The moment he stopped seeking answers in books and began to search for them in life itself. Before we continue, take a second to reflect. Have you ever achieved something you thought would make you happy, only to feel emptier than before? If so, you're walking the same path Tolstoy once did, and the next step in his journey may hold the key to yours. The search, science, philosophy, and faith. When reason fails, where do you go next? For Tolstoy, the collapse of logic wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a desperate search for something that could fill the silence inside him. He turned first to science, believing that if anyone could uncover life's purpose, it would be those who understood the universe itself. He devoured works on biology, astronomy, and physics, hoping that within the elegant order of nature, he'd find a trace of meaning. But science, for all its brilliance, gave him only structure, never purpose. It could explain how a tree grows, but not why it exists. It could trace the origins of the stars, but not the reason they shine. Tolstoy wrote, "Science revealed everything except the reason for its own existence." The more he learned, the more he realized knowledge alone could not rescue him. The human intellect, no matter how vast, could not heal the wound of meaninglessness. So he turned to philosophy. He studied Socrates and Aristotle, Pascal and Schopenhauer, minds that had wrestled with the same abyss. For a time he believed he was close to an answer. Yet the deeper he read, the more fragmented truth became. Each philosopher offered a different map of reality, but none could point to a destination. And Tolstoy began to sense the same paradox many thinkers face today. The more you analyze life, the further you drift from living it. He described philosophy as a mirror that reflects our confusion beautifully, but never dissolves it. By then he had exhausted the world of logic. He had climbed every intellectual ladder he could find, and at the top of each stood the same emptiness. So he did something radical. He began to observe the faith of ordinary people, the peasants, servants, and laborers who worked the soil from sunrise to nightfall. They had no libraries, no theories, and yet they seemed to move through life with peace he could not manufacture. Their secret, Tolstoy realized, was not ignorance, it was trust. They didn't need to prove that life had meaning. They lived as if it did. This revelation shook him. Perhaps the truth was not hidden in complex systems of thought, but in something profoundly simple, something the educated mind had learned to overlook. He began studying the sacred texts of the world, the Gospels, the Bhagavad Gita, the teachings of Buddha, the Tao Te Ching, and he was stunned by what he found, a shared language of compassion, humility, and service. Different words, different rituals, but one thread connecting them all, the belief that meaning begins where the self ends. Yet even as faith began to call him, Tolstoy resisted. He was too rational to surrender easily, too skeptical to believe blindly. He stood between two worlds, one of reason, cold and clear, the other of faith, warm but uncertain. It was here, in this tension, that he faced his greatest dilemma. Should I keep living by reason, knowing it leads to despair? Or should I leap into faith, knowing it defies logic? That question wasn't just philosophical, it was survival. Because without meaning, life itself had become unbearable. So Tolstoy made a decision that would shock his friends, his family, and his country. He would abandon everything he thought he knew and begin to live as if life already had meaning. He didn't want to study truth anymore. He wanted to embody it, and what he discovered next would completely redefine the way he, and perhaps we, understood existence. The discovery, meaning through compassion and simplicity. Tolstoy's revelation didn't arrive as lightning. It came as quiet clarity. After years of chasing knowledge, he began to watch the simplest people around him. Farmers, cobblers, mothers, those who worked from dawn to dusk. They lived in hardship, yet there was a lightness in them that his wealth had never given him. He noticed something extraordinary. They didn't ask, "What is the meaning of life?" They lived as if they already knew it. While the elite debated truth in salons and universities, the peasants found it in the rhythm of their daily lives, in caring for their families, in prayer before meals, in helping a neighbor without asking why. Their existence was not grand, but it was grounded, and that groundedness changed everything. Tolstoy began to realize that meaning doesn't come from ideas. It comes from connection. It was a radical shift. The man who once measured happiness by success now saw it reflected in humility. He wrote, "The only meaning of life is to serve the good that exists beyond myself." In that sentence, Tolstoy redefined purpose, not as a discovery of the mind, but as a practice of the heart. He understood that true peace wasn't found in control or knowledge, but in love, an active, selfless force that gives shape to chaos. To test this revelation, he changed his life completely. He gave away his royalties, wore peasant clothes, worked the fields with his hands, and opened his home to those in need. He sought no praise, no spotlight. What he wanted was alignment, to live according to what he had finally learned, that happiness isn't found in being served, but in serving. His friends called him insane. His family feared he had lost everything he'd worked for. But Tolstoy felt for the first time free. He wrote that the greatest trap of modern life is the illusion of control, that by owning, achieving, and knowing, we can secure meaning. But the opposite is true. The more we chase permanence, the faster it slips away. In surrendering what he had, Tolstoy discovered something he could never lose: peace of conscience. This discovery echoed through his later works. In The Death of Ivan Ilyich, he exposed the emptiness of a life lived for appearances. In Resurrection, he denounced social hypocrisy and celebrated compassion as humanity's highest calling. His writing transformed from literature into philosophy, from story into mirror. But perhaps the most profound line he ever wrote was this: "The meaning of life is not something to be found, it is something to be created through love." That realization made Tolstoy not just a novelist, but a guide for anyone lost in the noise of modern ambition. Because in the end, what he discovered was not a theory, it was a way of being, a way that says, live simply, love deeply, serve quietly. Everything else is a distraction. And yet, even after this awakening, his struggle wasn't over. His conviction would soon clash with his family, his church, and an empire that feared his ideas. The question was no longer whether he had found the meaning of life, but whether he could keep living it. The transformation, how it changed his life and writings. When Tolstoy found his new truth, he knew there was no going back. The man who had once written about emperors and aristocrats now wanted only to understand the human soul. And that desire demanded more than thought. It demanded transformation. He began by confronting his own comfort. The mansions, the banquets, the respect of high society, what once symbolized success, now felt like chains. He gave away much of his wealth, dressed in simple clothes, and worked alongside peasants on his land. His family watched in disbelief. To them, this was madness, a man throwing away greatness for humility. But for Tolstoy, this was not self-destruction. It was liberation. He wanted to live what he preached, that truth is found not in privilege, but in presence. Yet transformation has a cost. His wife, Sophia, could not accept his rejection of wealth and status. They had 13 children and an entire estate to manage. Her fear was practical. His was spiritual. Their marriage began to fracture under the weight of two incompatible worlds, one rooted in security, the other in surrender. Tolstoy's home became a battlefield of values, and as his personal life unraveled, his writing became sharper, more courageous. He turned from the beauty of fiction to the rawness of moral inquiry. In The Death of Ivan Ilyich, he dissected the illusion of a successful life with surgical precision. In Resurrection, he attacked corruption, hypocrisy, and the spiritual emptiness of modern society. In essays like A Confession and The Kingdom of God is Within You, he stripped faith of its rituals and brought it back to its essence: compassion, simplicity, and action. His words no longer entertained. They unsettled, and that made him dangerous. The Russian Orthodox Church condemned him. The Tsar's police monitored his movements. To the institutions of power, Tolstoy was no longer a writer. He was a threat, a man preaching freedom not through revolution, but through conscience. Yet his influence only grew. His essays reached across continents, finding readers like Mahatma Gandhi, who would later write to him, calling his philosophy of love and non-violence the greatest weapon against tyranny. Through Tolstoy, the seed of peaceful resistance was planted, a seed that would one day move nations. But despite his impact on the world, Tolstoy himself was still restless. As he aged, the tension between his ideals and his daily life became unbearable. The fame he tried to escape followed him everywhere. Crowds came to his estate to hear him speak, to touch the robe of the man who had renounced everything. He began to feel trapped once again, this time not by wealth, but by the myth of his own sainthood. And so, at the age of 82, in the freezing winter of 1910, Tolstoy made one last decision. He walked away from everything, his family, his estate, his fame, and boarded a train into the unknown. He would die days later in a small station called Astapovo, lying on a simple cot surrounded by strangers. No titles, no applause, only peace. The world mourned the loss of a literary titan. But Tolstoy had finally achieved what he'd spent a lifetime seeking, a death without fear. And in that silence, he left behind not just novels, but a blueprint, a way to live with purpose, even when everything else fades. The legacy, what we can learn today. Tolstoy's story is more than a biography, it's a mirror. Because in his struggle we see our own. He had everything our modern world still tells us to chase: wealth, recognition, success, and yet he felt nothing. His life became the ultimate experiment in human happiness, one that ended with a truth most people spend a lifetime avoiding. The meaning of life is not something you acquire, it's something you give. That insight might sound simple, but simplicity is what the modern mind resists the most. We chase achievements, possessions, and approval, believing that purpose hides somewhere just beyond the next milestone. Tolstoy discovered the opposite, that meaning appears when you stop running, when you begin to live for others, not just yourself. His philosophy wasn't a denial of reason, it was its completion. He didn't reject knowledge, he placed it in its rightful context, as a tool, not a master. He realized that reason without love leads to despair, while love guided by reason creates harmony. That was the balance he had searched for all along, and this is where Tolstoy feels more relevant than ever. In a world drowning in information and starving for meaning, his message cuts through like light in fog. To live well is not to have more, but to be more present, more compassionate, more human. He also reminds us that transformation doesn't require perfection. Tolstoy never claimed to be a saint. He doubted, he failed, he wrestled with his own contradictions until the end. But he kept questioning. He never stopped trying to align his outer life with his inner truth. That persistence, that refusal to settle for shallow comfort, is what made his life extraordinary. And maybe that's the lesson for us. That meaning isn't found in grand revelations or cosmic answers, but in the small, consistent acts that make us feel alive, showing kindness when it's inconvenient, forgiving when it's difficult, giving when no one is watching. If Tolstoy's journey teaches anything, it's that happiness doesn't come from finding your purpose. It comes from creating it. Every day, in every choice. He once wrote, "The sole meaning of life is to serve humanity." It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. So now the question returns to us. What are you serving? Are you living for applause or for peace? Are you collecting achievements or moments that matter? Because the truth is, meaning isn't waiting at the end of your journey. It's hiding in the next small act of love. If this story made you reflect, share it with someone who might be searching for the same light. And if you want to keep exploring the minds that shape the way we think and feel, subscribe. Because the next story might just change the way you see